have we really recovered from COVID-19? Q1 GDP numbers will be out tomorrow and they're expected to be very, very good. But before we start cheering, we need to understand why they will be very, very good. Possibly because they come on a low base of a minus 24% drop in the same period last year. My colleague Poonam is joining us now, giving us a snapshot of all of the various expectations from the Q1 GDP numbers tomorrow.
Well, all eyes would be, of course, on Q1 GDP. April to June quarter did see good amount of impact on account of the COVID second wave. It was only in the month of June that we did see the impact of second wave receding. As a result, we are seeing that a lot of economists are seeing GDP for Q1 anywhere between 19 to 21%. Some of the economists like Deutsche Bank also see GDP at 23%, and Reserve Bank of India expects the GDP at 21.4%. Do note that Q1 GDP is likely to be in high double digits, A, on account of a favorable base, B, that we have seen fairly resilient corporate sector, industry sector is definitely is likely to support the overall GDP. We are seeing recovery there. The impact of the COVID second wave on the contact services sector was also lower than expected. However, we should of course be watching out for how the agriculture, the rural economy shaped up, because in second wave, this section of the economy was most impacted. We should be seeing very slight support from the government spending, and private capex has been subdued in Q1. But our conversations with a lot of the bankers to suggest that there are definite positive signs of private capex to pick up in select sectors at least, and also that they're seeing good amount of pickup in terms of the overall economic momentum. While the risk of the COVID's third wave is certainly there, we also need to watch out for that if at all this risk does not materialize in a very severe manner, then there are upside risks to the FY22 GDP estimate itself, as a lot of high frequency indicators, be it GST collections, e-way bills, manufacturing PMI, power consumption, etc., are surely doing well.
GDP numbers for the first quarter of FY22 will be out tomorrow, and there's going to be no surprise. I can confidently say that the GDP would have grown in the high double digits. Now, that confidence doesn't come from any super performance of the Indian economy, but from the simple fact that the GDP Q1 growth will be on the base of quarter one in the last financial year, which was the worst 3 months for the Indian economy in its history, because we were just hit by the pandemic and we went into a nationwide lockdown. In fact, the GDP contracted as much as 24% in the first quarter of the last financial year. So it is clear that this year we will be up. Now, it could be up to 15% up, 18% up, or 21% up, depending on who you ask. The ET Now poll says we will grow by about 21% in the first quarter of this financial year. But we need to go beyond that headline number, whatever it may be, and look at what are the important factors to really see and read between the lines. Helping us do that today is Dr. Soumyakanti Ghosh. He's a Group Chief Economist of the State Bank of India. Dr. Ghosh, great to have you on the show as always. Give us your opening comments on what you are looking out for from tomorrow's number.
Yeah, thank you, Tamanna, for having me on the show. See, there are two clear things which we are looking at the numbers today. In fact, the first thing we are looking is that the total amount of loss which is going to happen in the first quarter. Last year, if you remember, the total loss was estimated at 11 lakh crores. And subsequently, as the economy turned the corner, the losses went down significantly. So the first thing we'd like to see is what is the loss in Q1 of this year compared to the first quarter of the last year. So that will give an idea of how basically, as now believed mostly by consensus estimates, that the second wave impact has been much muted than the first wave. So that will give an idea. The second important thing, and that's actually will make the difference. basically will be the gap between the GDP and the GVA estimates. In fact, we are actually number crunching some of the numbers before I came to this interview. I think you could actually see the significant divergence between the GVA and the GDP, because the indirect tax collections in the first quarter of the current fiscal, I'm leaving aside the direct tax collection, but that is not computed as a part of the GDP estimates because these are all on factor incomes. So this indirect tax collection is one of the highest in the last several decades. And given the fact that these indirect taxes, less subsidies is added onto the GVA to get at a GDP number, to me what is important is the GVA number. So if the gap between the two is significantly on the higher side, I mean, there is a possibility that it could be higher, then I would obviously look into the GVA numbers, because this tax collection could be some sort of a statistical artifact, which is in fact propping up the number. And the final number, and third point is that whether it could be more than 20% or it could be less than 20%, it will entirely depend on how this net indirect taxes number is given out by the CSO. So I think these are the three things which I will closely follow in the number tomorrow.
So what would really tell us that we have turned the corner? Now, as I explained in the beginning of this interview, a high, say even 20% plus GDP growth in Q1 would just be a statistical aberration in that sense, because it comes on the back of a really big plunge in growth last year at the same time. So what is that number which would tell us that we have turned the corner? Should we be comparing with Q1 of FY20, and how far away are we from there? Because even if we grow at 20%, for example, or 21%, we would still be 3% lower than, a complete no growth or no reduction situation.
No, I think you are correct. The best way to compare is that with the Q1 FY20 numbers, and also look into the quarterly seasonally adjusted growth rate over every quarter. So I think now tomorrow, if you ask me, the year-on-year number may not have much meaning, but I would like to look into the quarter-on-quarter momentum, whether it is higher than the historical trend, because that will give an idea that the economy has got some sort of a momentum. But the good thing is that the mobility numbers, as for example, our business activity index in the month of June, July has actually moved up. So, and that is the reason that why a lot of people are saying that the growth would be in 20s, or even some of the numbers which are actually going, it could be in excess of 25%, because globally there has been a consensus during the first wave that higher is the mobility, the higher could be the GDP, because as people comes out of home, activity starts working. But I would like to take a contrary, like a different view over here. If you, when you were comparing the first quarter growth rate, which has now been, announced by almost most other countries, the average first quarter growth rate quarterly was around 12% if I take into account all economies. So even if India grows at say 18% or 20%, it will be higher than the average. But whether that increased mobility translates into a higher economic activity, or it will obviously translate into a higher economic activity, but whether it will translate into a higher output growth or GDP growth over a point of time, that only time can tell, because historical evidence shows that this link gets weaker as we move along, as we have moved along from the last year. So from their point of view, the incremental benefits from a higher mobility as the economy gets opened up continuously could become lower as we move along in this year.
Now, these Q1 numbers will also possibly take into account the hit we've had from the second wave. That's widely expected. But I want to look on forward from them. Dr. Ghosh, is it safe to say confidently now that our recovery from the second wave has been pretty robust? High frequency indicators are showing this. Mobility, as you mentioned, is showing this. GST collections is showing this. Digital payments and a host of other parameters. So do you think it's safe to say that we've had a pretty robust recovery? And then what are the headwinds now you see ahead?
See, I think, Tamanna, yes, we can say that the recovery has been good The recovery has been also robust if you look into terms of mobility indicator. But let me just point out some points of caution over here. I think one data which starkly point out when the CSO released the data in May of this year was the decline in private final consumption expenditure in 2021, which was around 7.5 lakh crores. So basically, and the other important thing is that all along we have been showing this, that there is an asymmetry in the numbers. For example, corporate tax collections in FY21 had declined by around 1 lakh crore from the budgeted number. But if you look at the tax collections of the larger corporates, they have actually increased significantly. So that means that the smaller companies has not been doing that well if we just purely go by even the tax collections. So this dichotomy between the larger corporates and the smaller corporates, the dichotomy between the organized sector and the unorganized sectors, and the dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots. Actually, that is the important thing which we need to see in the coming days. So, yes, the headline GDP will show some signs of definite comfort tomorrow, but whether this dichotomy, you have been able to break through this dichotomy, that will be clear as if we go by the expenditure side numbers, because that has not been so much encouraging even in FY21. And I will also actually closely look into that numbers to see whether the expenditure consumption expenditure has continued to moderate or it has gained some traction in the first quarter. So headline numbers are one thing and the demand slide is other thing.
Yeah, so consumption definitely has still been one sort of weak link. It's been improving, but we have to see whether consumption, actually picks up. Maybe festive season will see that turnaround, etc. The other part of the puzzle when we're talking about the Indian economy, and not really with the GDP numbers, but when we're looking ahead and will have an impact, is inflation, isn't it? And in this context, your long-standing demand that fuel prices be cut on petrol and diesel is clearly not going to be listened to right now. Do you think it's sustainable to keep taking such high taxes on petrol and diesel? And what is the long-term impact you see on consumption because of this, Dr. Ghosh?
No, I think that's a very important point. In the past also, we have pointed out that higher fuel prices has a significant impact on discretionary consumption. And if you have fuel prices at this level, it will be very difficult to sustain the recovery. If I leave aside petrol prices, in fact, for the diesel prices, you will see that the terms of trade actually has moved adversely against the agricultural sector. And given the fact that the agricultural sector is not having the best of monsoon in terms of the distribution, that could be some sort of an factor which could impinge on the rural sector growth rate. The other important thing is that, as you know, there has been a lot of debate by saying that this inflation episode is transitory. And I think this transitory word has been used by all central banks across the world, including RBI. And inflation by definition can only be transitory if there are no second round impact. But to me, if the fuel prices stay at this level for an extended period, and when the economy opens up and people starts moving even much more, I think the second round event could pinch us much more. And from that point of view, if the expectations get anchored, the inflation numbers may not decline from the current levels. So, and please remember that India's inflation was higher during the pandemic also, as opposed to other economies where inflation is lower during the pandemic, has moved up, and it has been higher even post-pandemic. So I'm not sure about the inflation trajectory, whether it could be permanent or transitory. I hope it's transitory, but the fuel prices needs to adjust so as to give us a comforting sense that it will aid recovery when the economy opens up after a sufficient number of people are vaccinated.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one last point. What do you think is going to be the importance this time round of the festive season of Q3 really for the economy? Traditionally has been a very important situation or a very important quarter. We've seen that last year as well, where the recovery really started to come in. Are you hoping to see a similar trend this time around as well?
See, Tamanna, I hope that happens, but as you can know that a lot of states are still not opened up fully. You have hearing news every day that states are extending their lockdowns, and I think some of the states have now gone into September. For example, West Bengal was one state which yesterday announced that lockdown restrictions will continue to remain over there. And my sense is that the scenario is still completely uncertain. Out of the total 93 crore adult population, we have vaccinated around 70% of them, which is basically 63 crores, or a little less than that, because that number takes into account people having second dose. So I hope that some sort of an herd immunity has already come in. If that is the case, and if the third wave is not as bad, and if we hope that the third wave is at least, even if it's like the first wave, I think that would be a definite booster for the consumption sentiments. But as of now, no one knows, what could be an extent of the third wave. We can only hope that it is not as bad as the earlier second wave. And even if it is is like the first wave, I think that will be very good for the Indian economy.
Yeah, so clearly you're right. That is an uncertain factor that no one can quite predict. One can only hope, but what we can take some hope from is that July and August seems to see a definitive pickup. It just really needs to sustain. The important point that Soumyakanti Ghosh made, that in the GDP data, even if the top line looks great, you have to look at whether that dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots has widened or not. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.